It began like any other high-profile hearing, a cold courtroom, marble floors, reporters clustered along the back wall, their pens ready to capture a headline. Judge Edward Chen presided with the calm authority of a man who rarely encountered resistance he couldn't outmaneuver. His reputation was as precise as his black robe, fair, methodical, and quietly ruthless with anyone who dared embarrass the court. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to embarrass the court. She came to expose it. She entered in a tailored navy suit, a single leather folder under her arm. Her steps were measured, her expression almost serene. From his bench, Chen watched her the way a chess master watches a rookie, amused, certain of her limitations, already planning his endgame. The clerk called the session to order. This hearing will address the petition to stay enforcement of the executive order regarding public assembly restrictions. Chen steepled his fingers. Congresswoman Crockett, you may proceed. She inclined her head politely. Thank you, Your Honor. Her voice was calm but unyielding. Today I am here not to disrupt order, but to remind this court of its duty to the Constitution. Chen's eyebrows lifted, just enough to show his disdain. Your presence is noted. However, the record will reflect that this proceeding is not a platform for political statements. She didn't flinch. Then let the record also reflect that this proceeding has consequences far beyond these walls. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Chen smiled faintly. Congresswoman, would you agree that the language of the order is clear? Crystal. Then you also agree that enforcement is a matter of statutory compliance? No, Your Honor. No? Chen leaned back in his chair, folding his hands like a man savoring checkmate. Would you care to explain to this court how an order legally signed, duly published, and properly enforced is somehow invalid? A hush fell. Reporters clicked their pens. This was the trap. Force her to challenge the legitimacy of the law itself and watch her unravel. Jasmine didn't shift, didn't frown, didn't even blink. Instead, she calmly opened her folder, and as she did, Chen's smile faltered by the smallest degree, because he hadn't planned for the one variable he couldn't control, a woman who already knew exactly where the trap was and had come prepared to step right over it. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a held breath. Judge Chen waited for Jasmine to stammer, to search for a way around his question. He had used this tactic for years, pressing witnesses into a corner so they'd lash out or contradict themselves. But Jasmine wasn't a witness, and she didn't move an inch. She lifted a single sheet from her folder. Her voice stayed low, unhurried. Your Honor, the issue here isn't whether the order was signed or published. Chen arched an eyebrow. Then what, pray tell, is at issue? She laid the paper gently on the lectern. Whether an order can override constitutional protections when it seeks to define public safety so broadly that it criminalizes dissent. A few reporters exchanged looks. One started typing faster. Chen's fingers tapped his bench. Once, twice. Congresswoman, this court is not here to entertain rhetorical. It's not rhetorical. Her interruption was soft, unapologetic. It's a question of whether the judiciary will be complicit in redefining free assembly as a public hazard. The judge's expression flickered. This was not the narrative he'd prepared for. A well-packaged argument he could dismiss as grandstanding. He tried again. Are you asserting that the executive order was designed with malicious intent? No. She paused, eyes locked with his. I'm asserting it was designed with indifference. A hush fell over the gallery. Even the clerk stopped writing. Jasmine lifted another page, a table of incident reports. I have here records of 73 peaceful assemblies dispersed by force in the past 12 months, not because violence was present, but because discomfort was. Chen shifted in his chair, the first hint of unease rippling under his practiced calm. Your Honor, discomfort is not a legal threshold. His jaw tensed. Order in this courtroom. Her gaze didn't waver. That's exactly what I'm asking for. Murmurs spread along the back rows. Jasmine continued, her tone steady. If we are to measure legality by what is signed, rather than by what is right, then the Constitution becomes a prop. She slid the records closer to the clerk. And I didn't come here to be part of a performance. Chen's hand hovered over his gavel, but he didn't bring it down, because even he knew. He couldn't gavel away the truth. He drew in a slow breath. The court will take a short recess. Jasmine inclined her head, calm as ever. But as she stepped back, she caught the look on his face. For the first time, Judge Edward Chen wasn't sure which one of them held the power in that room. When Judge Chen stood and disappeared into his chambers, the courtroom released a collective exhale. Reporters darted into the aisle, murmuring their headlines. Clerks whispered nervously, casting glances at Jasmine as if she might explode at any moment. But she didn't move. She simply rested her hand on the lectern, her expression unreadable. Inside the chambers, Judge Chen closed the door with more force than he intended. His clerk trailed behind him, arms full of folders Jasmine had submitted. "Sir, you asked for a recess. Should I prepare a statement for the press?" "No." His voice was clipped. He took a seat at the long polished conference table, flipping open the top document. Each page felt heavier than the last. Records of assemblies, affidavits from protesters, sworn statements describing harassment that never made it to the news. Chen's pulse drummed in his temples. It wasn't the evidence itself that bothered him. It was the method. Jasmine hadn't argued in hypotheticals. She hadn't resorted to slogans. She'd used his own courtroom language, evidence, precedent, documentation, to box him in. The clerk shifted nervously. "Sir, is there anything you'd like me to say to the press if they ask about your response?" Chen's eyes narrowed as he scanned the last page, where Jasmine had handwritten a single line. "The law is not a costume for power." He closed the file. "Tell them the judge is reviewing the submissions. And if they ask whether the Congresswoman will be reprimanded for speaking out of turn?" Chen's jaw worked for a moment. He'd expected her to raise her voice, to slip into righteous indignation he could label as disorderly conduct. Instead, she had stayed calm, surgical, and that was the part that unsettled him most. "Tell them nothing." Back in the courtroom, Jasmine remained at her table. A few reporters had inched closer, hoping she might grant an off-the-record comment. She didn't. She watched the empty judge's bench, her gaze steady, as though daring it to blink first. One journalist whispered to a colleague, "She came here to get thrown out." "No," the other replied. "She came here to show he couldn't." When Chen finally returned, the hush was instant. He settled into his seat more heavily this time. "This court will resume." Jasmine didn't stand. She didn't need to, because without raising her voice, she had forced him to do the one thing he despised: reconsider. Chen's gavel rested at his side, unused. He cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have the court's attention." She looked up, the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Then let's proceed." And for the first time in his career, Judge Edward Chen realized that all his preparations, all his carefully crafted traps, had been designed for opponents who wanted to win, not for someone like Jasmine, who had come simply to reveal. Judge Chen gripped the arms of his chair as if steadying himself against a tide he hadn't foreseen. He had imagined this proceeding as a simple demonstration of authority, a chance to remind everyone who commanded the room. But Jasmine's calm refusal to bend had changed everything. She stood slowly, her leather folder tucked under one arm. Her tone stayed soft, never rising, never breaking. "With the court's permission, I will now present the supporting materials." Chen nodded, though it felt more like surrender than consent. Jasmine laid out the first document. "This is a sworn affidavit from a legal observer." She witnessed uniformed officers forcibly dispersing an assembly that remained peaceful until law enforcement escalated. She placed it on the clerk's table with the quiet finality of a verdict. A second document. This is the state's own incident report, documenting no injuries, no property damage, yet citing a credible threat to public order as the justification for arrests. She paused to let the words sink in. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. A third document. And this is an email obtained via FOIA request from the office of the executive who signed the order. It describes the gatherings as an optics problem, not a public safety issue. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Chen cleared his throat. Congresswoman, you are aware that the relevance of these materials must be weighed against the statutory language. Jasmine didn't flinch. Yes, Your Honor, and I am also aware that the statutory language cannot be used to camouflage unconstitutional overreach. Her eyes met his, unwavering. If this court finds otherwise, then it must also accept that a state's discomfort is grounds to nullify free assembly. She set the final document on the stack. That is not law, that is preference. Chen opened his mouth to object, but no words came, because the evidence wasn't rhetorical. It was documented. It was time-stamped. It was real. Jasmine closed her folder with a quiet click that sounded louder than any gavel. I am prepared to answer any questions. For a long moment, the judge didn't move. The gallery was so quiet that the old courthouse clock could be heard ticking, each second more accusing than the last. Chen's gaze drifted to the stack of records. He had wanted her to lose her composure. Instead, she had forced him to reckon with his own. One of the junior clerks shifted uneasily, whispering, Sir, do you wish to proceed? Chen exhaled slowly. Yes. But in his chest, he felt something he hadn't expected. Doubt. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to, because she hadn't come to argue. She had come to document. And in that moment, the entire courtroom understood. The trap hadn't been for her. It had been for anyone who thought she would walk in unprepared. Judge Chen adjusted his robe, gathering whatever composure he had left. He had spent years mastering the subtle performance of power, the steady tone, the measured gaze, the small smile that said, "You can't win here." But Jasmine hadn't come to win. She'd come to show the game for what it was. Congresswoman, he began, voice pitched lower than before, you must understand the difference between policy criticism and legal invalidation. I do. Her answer was immediate, too immediate. Chen's jaw tensed. Then you surely concede that this court cannot overstep the boundaries of statutory interpretation. Jasmine folded her hands neatly atop the lectern. Your Honor, I do not ask you to overstep. She paused, her gaze calm, as though she were explaining something to a colleague, not an adversary. I ask you to remember that the boundary between enforcement and oppression is not measured by statutory language, but by constitutional principle. A murmur rose in the gallery. Chen tapped his gavel. Once, twice. Order. But the word sounded hollow. He tried again, his voice sharpening. I must caution you that further attempts to conflate policy intent with constitutional breach could be construed as contempt. Jasmine lifted her chin slightly. Would you prefer I call it what it is? Chen blinked. Excuse me? She didn't raise her voice, didn't shift her tone. You can call it statutory enforcement. I can call it systemic intimidation. Her words settled over the courtroom like a velvet hammer. For the first time, Chen's hands closed into fists. Congresswoman, respectfully, Your Honor, she interrupted, so gently it almost didn't feel like interruption at all. If the law demands silence from those harmed by it, then the law itself is already in contempt. You could have heard a pin drop. Reporters stared at their notebooks, pens hovering in the air. Even the clerk who'd been furiously typing froze. Chen looked as though he might stand, might declare a recess, might banish her from the chamber altogether. But he didn't, because Jasmine hadn't cursed him, hadn't insulted him, hadn't raised her voice. She'd simply told the truth, so plainly that he had no dignified escape. She continued, her tone steady as ever. This court may choose to ignore these records. She gestured to the pile of affidavits, but it cannot erase them. Chen said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound defensive. Jasmine stepped back, her hands still folded, and in that moment it was clear his gavel might end the hearing, but it couldn't end the question she'd placed in the center of the room. The session adjourned with none of the usual ceremony. Judge Chen rapped his gavel twice, but it sounded more like a formality than a declaration of authority. Jasmine gathered her folder calmly. Her hands didn't tremble, her eyes never left the judge's. He watched her as she stepped away from the lectern, feeling the familiar fortress of his courtroom dissolve plank by plank. The reporters didn't immediately rise. They sat for a moment, scribbling notes, digesting everything they'd just witnessed, because this hadn't been a typical hearing. It hadn't been a debate. It had been a quiet demolition of every performance Judge Chen thought would protect him. In the hallway, cameras waited. The doors swung open, and Jasmine emerged into a blast of flashbulbs and shouted questions. Congresswoman, do you believe the judge acted impartially? Do you plan to escalate this to the circuit court? Was this a publicity stunt? She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She lifted her folder and spoke in the same steady voice. This was not about the judge. This was about the people whose rights were erased and whose stories were buried. Then she held up the stack of records, photos, affidavits, reports with signatures that no one could deny. These belong in the public record, and now they are. Her aide leaned in, whispering urgently, "Ma'am, social media is exploding. The documents are everywhere." Indeed, even as she stood there, Jasmine saw it, a journalist holding up a tablet, displaying a headline in bold, breaking, "Court records show, systematic suppression of peaceful protest." She turned her head just enough to see Judge Chen step into the hall. He looked older in that moment, smaller, surrounded by cameras he no longer controlled. Someone thrust a microphone at him. "Judge Chen, do you have any comment on these allegations?" His mouth opened, but no sound came, because the script he'd relied on for years had evaporated. Jasmine didn't wait for him to recover. She stepped to the side so the cameras could catch both of them in the frame, and then, softly, just loud enough for those closest to hear, she said, "You built this hearing to expose me." She gestured to the reporters. "Instead, it exposed you." A hush fell so complete that even the press held their breath. Chen stared at her, his expression caught somewhere between fury and something that looked a lot like regret. Jasmine turned to leave. As she walked past the banks of cameras, someone called out, "How do you feel tonight?" She paused, her hand resting lightly on the door. "I feel like truth doesn't always need to shout." She met Chen's eyes one last time. Sometimes it just needs to be documented. And with that, she stepped into the darkening hallway, her footsteps the only sound in the stunned quiet she left behind. When the cameras finally turned away, Judge Chen didn't move. He stood in the hallway, watching the reporters swarm around Jasmine's retreating figure. Their lenses didn't bother to pan back to him. Their questions didn't circle to his defense. They were too busy chasing the woman who'd walked into his courtroom and turned a performance into a reckoning. His clerk hovered nearby, clutching a file Chen hadn't had time to read. "Sir, should we prepare a statement?" Chen didn't answer, because in the pit of his stomach, he knew no statement would be enough. He turned and walked back into chambers, closing the door behind him. The silence there was thick, heavy with all the things he could have said, all the ways he could have steered the narrative if he'd just anticipated her approach. But Jasmine hadn't been playing the game he'd prepared for. She hadn't come to posture or provoke. she'd come to document, and that was something he had never learned how to defeat. He sat at his desk, the stack of affidavits Jasmine left behind staring up at him like evidence of his own complacency. He flipped the top page open, reading lines he already knew were true. I was there. I saw it, and no one listened. His hands trembled, because he'd built a reputation on the idea that the law was unassailable, that the right procedure was more important than the right outcome. And in one afternoon, she'd made him realize how easily procedure became an excuse. His phone buzzed, a text from a colleague on the appellate bench. "You need to respond. She's controlling the narrative." But he couldn't, because for the first time, he didn't know which narrative was defensible. He closed the folder, exhaling a shaky breath. Outside the window, the courthouse steps were still alive with reporters and protesters, holding up copies of Jasmine's evidence like trophies. He had thought he could embarrass her. Instead, he'd given her a stage. And the worst part, the part that burned under his skin, was that some part of him knew she was right. At that same moment, Jasmine was already blocks away, her phone buzzing with messages she ignored. Her aide hurried beside her, voice excited. "You have 4 networks asking for interviews. Everyone's quoting you." Jasmine kept walking. "I didn't come here for quotes." "Then what did you come for?" She didn't hesitate. "Accountability." And in that one word, she claimed something no gavel could revoke. Back in chambers, Chen sat alone, the final line of her submission still echoing in his mind. "The law is only as strong as the conscience that enforces it." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he still knew how to be the man behind the bench. By dawn the next morning, Jasmine Crockett's name was everywhere. Cable news anchors replayed the hearing in split-screen loops. Social media platforms overflowed with hashtags. At the courthouse steps, reporters gathered again, waiting to see whether Chen would make a statement. He didn't. Because every time he tried to compose one, he heard her voice in his memory, calm, unshakable. If the law demands silence from those harmed by it, then the law itself is already in contempt. It was too perfect a line, too honest to spin, and so he stayed inside, hoping the storm would pass. But it didn't. Outside, community leaders began arriving. People Jasmine had quietly defended over the years. One by one, they stood before the microphones. A union organizer, a civil rights attorney, a retired teacher, each of them telling the same story, that Jasmine Crockett never asked permission to call out hypocrisy, that she never needed a camera to stand her ground. Inside his office, Chen turned on the news. He needed to know how bad it was. He watched a clip of Jasmine stepping past the press, her voice measured. "I don't believe in spectacle for its own sake, but I do believe in documentation. This was about reminding the law that it serves people, not power." A reporter cut back to the studio. "And Judge Edward Chen has yet to respond to the mounting criticism." He switched the channel. Same story. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail, a weary voice he recognized, an old mentor who'd taught him that decorum was everything. "Edward, you underestimated her. And now you'll have to decide whether to defend the process or confront your part in it." He pressed delete without listening to the end, but the words stuck. Meanwhile, Jasmine returned to her district office. Her staff was buzzing, taking calls, scheduling interviews, fielding praise and backlash in equal measure. She walked past them without stopping, because she knew this wasn't over. She stepped into her private office, closing the door behind her. For the first time since the hearing, she allowed herself to exhale, and even then, she didn't smile, because victory wasn't the point. Accountability was. Outside, crowds gathered with homemade signs. "The law must answer. Silence is not neutral. We saw it." And in every conversation, in every headline, one name kept surfacing, not as an authority, but as an example of what happens when you mistake procedure for justice. Judge Edward Chen. In less than 24 hours, the city had chosen whose side of history it wanted to be on, and it wasn't his. Chen hadn't slept. He sat in his chambers most of the night, watching the same clip replay over and over. Jasmine standing at the lectern, her voice even. The law is not a costume for power. Every time he replayed it, the words dug deeper. By morning, he knew he couldn't hide behind statements anymore. He needed to see her, to look her in the eye and convince himself that he was still right, or at least not entirely wrong. He didn't call ahead. He didn't send an assistant. He walked alone to her office, ignoring the cameras that trailed behind him like scavengers. When he entered, her staff froze. One aide rose, uncertain. "Judge Chen, do you have an appointment?" "No." His voice felt unfamiliar in his throat. "But I'd like to speak to the Congresswoman." They hesitated, glancing toward the closed door at the back. Then, wordlessly, one of them knocked. A moment later, Jasmine appeared in the doorway. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look angry. She looked exactly as she had in court, ready. Chen tried to summon the smooth authority that had served him for decades. It wouldn't come. "May I?" He gestured toward her office. She nodded, stepping aside. Inside, he took in the spare decor: a bookshelf, a single framed photo of her family, a potted plant wilting a little at the edges. It wasn't a room meant to impress. It was a room meant to work. He turned to face her. "You must know why I'm here." She folded her arms lightly. "I assume you're here because you have a question you never asked." Chen swallowed. Why did you do it?" "Do what?" "Make it public. Make me the symbol." Jasmine tilted her head. "I didn't make you a symbol." Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "You did that when you tried to turn the hearing into a spectacle." He looked down, the floor suddenly more comfortable to meet than her eyes. I thought you'd lose control." "I know." She let the admission hang in the air. When he looked up, her expression hadn't changed. "And when you didn't," he continued, "I didn't know how to respond." Jasmine exhaled slowly. "You could have listened." The words were so simple they were almost an act of mercy, but they struck harder than any accusation. Chen closed his eyes. "And now?" "Now," she said quietly, "you get to decide whether your silence was a mistake or a habit." For the first time in a long time, Chen had no retort, no procedural shield, no prepared line. He nodded once, the motion small and exhausted. "I'm sorry." Jasmine didn't say she forgave him. She didn't offer comfort, because some truths didn't need her to soften them. Instead, she held his gaze and spoke with the same unflinching certainty that had undone his courtroom. "Then don't be sorry. Be better." Chen swallowed hard, and as he turned to leave, he realized that no verdict he'd ever signed had demanded as much courage as that one sentence. Jasmine stood by the window after Chen left, her reflection layered over the city skyline. Outside, the traffic carried on as though nothing had changed, but she knew that somewhere in 100 conversations, in offices, in living rooms, in late-night newsrooms, everything had. Her aide knocked softly. "The networks are calling again. They all want you live tonight." "No." She didn't turn. "But this is the biggest moment you've ever—" "I didn't do it for the moment." The aide hesitated. "What should I tell them?" Jasmine took a slow breath. "Tell them the record speaks for itself." The aide left, closing the door with a quiet click. For a long time, Jasmine stood alone, watching her reflection blur in the glass. She thought of every person who'd ever been silenced under the excuse of order, of every face in the courtroom, straining to look away from what they knew was true, and of the judge who'd finally realized that all the rules in the world couldn't protect a lie forever. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something rarer, something she'd spent years searching for. Clarity. Her phone buzzed again. Another reporter, Another headline, another attempt to shape the story. She let it ring. Because some truths didn't need her voice anymore. They were alive now, in every affidavit, every broadcast replay, every person who had watched a gavel hesitate and ask themselves why. Outside, a woman passed by the office window carrying a sign that read, "Justice is not a performance." Jasmine felt the corner of her mouth curve into the smallest smile. She turned away from the glass and reached for her folder. It was lighter than it had been that morning, because she'd left what mattered behind, where the whole country could see it. As she walked out into the evening, she didn't look back. She didn't need to, because the silence she left behind wasn't emptiness. It was evidence. And evidence, real evidence, never needed her to say another word. I didn't come to that courtroom to humiliate anyone. I came because there are people who don't get invited into rooms like that, whose stories never make it into the record. Some called it defiance, some called it disrespect. But the truth is, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations. I only did what too many are too afraid to do. I showed up with evidence and refused to let it be ignored. Silence is comfortable for those who have never paid its price. And if my presence made the silence uncomfortable, then maybe it was never justice to begin with. We can all pretend it was just another hearing, but deep down, we know better. Because when the law becomes a costume for power, all it takes is one voice to remind everyone. The truth doesn't need permission.